Thank you all so much for coming, for turning out. This is a very nice turnout. And my thanks to Mark and Brian and Matthew and Jude, everyone here at Opera America, for making this evening possible. And actually being here closes one of those little life circles for me. For several years in the late 60s and early 70s, I was an executive at a small foundation, the Martha Baird Rockefeller Fund for Music. We gave grants to young artists, including many singers, and to organizations that hired them or otherwise supported them, like regional opera companies. In 1970, I'm pretty sure that was the year, Glyn Ross, who at that time was the director of the Seattle Opera, came to us with a proposal to help underwrite an exploratory meeting looking toward formation of a new service organization for the field. Glyn said, "We have Central Opera Service, and it's great, but we need a horse trading association." We thought the proposal was promising, and since I was the opera guy at the fund, it fell to me to do whatever due diligence was involved and write up the recommendation for presentation to the Board of Trustees. And the trustees approved the grant, and the meeting took place out in Seattle, and I flew out there and participated in the meeting. So I can claim to have been present and had a small hand in the founding of Opera America. And Mark, while I don't know that you've got a horse trading association here, but you do have an absolutely invaluable resource for our field, for which I'd like to add my thanks and appreciation. I'll be talking for 30 or 35 minutes about my book. Then Mark and I will converse about it and some of the issues it raises. And then we'll have some Q&A. And finally, a little Meet the Author time. We've already had some, but we'll have some at the end as well. And we have a few books for sale. The last book standing at the moment, folks, because the first printing of Opera and Opera has sold out. And the second printing... The second printing won't be ready before November 1st or so. You'll notice my book has a title and a subtitle. The title just means that opera is a complete unity in itself. It's not a form of something else, a form of music, a form of theater, or some combination of other art forms, but a thing all its own. And the subtitle is pretty self-evident, I guess. Here we have our glorious art form, one of the great resources of beauty and truth and social continuity for over 400 years now, and it finds itself in a pickle. And I insist that this is a pickle that goes beyond the usual generational disruption. It's our own and special. The most obvious problem is that for about 100 years now, the form has not experienced sufficient creative renewal. There have been plenty of operas written, but to the great body of work that constitutes the operatic canon, very little has been added, and most of that in the first 30 years or so of that time. We have to face the fact that the broad cultural movements we call modern and especially postmodern have proved ill-adapted to opera. And as you might expect of an art form that has gone creatively stagnant, with the passing of generations, its interpreters have been progressively lost touch with the instinctual sources of their own work. And it's not only that. In opera's case, the canon very powerfully states a whole set of cultural, social, and political attitudes that we have a lot of difficulty with. This isn't just a great books problem. With a book, however we reinterpret it, it remains itself. There it still is. We can return to it on its own terms. But with any performance form, the work has to be interpreted to even exist. And if the interpreters can't or won't do that, then there it isn't. We don't have anything like full access to these masterworks. Yet we don't have anything of comparable value to put in their place. Can't live with them, can't live without them. a situation I call both parasital and parasitical. That's about where we are right now, and that's what my book is about. The book was written in real time over an 18-year period, so it's sort of in diary form. Everything in it is based on performances that occurred during that time, which is the way opera actually occurs in our lives. It doesn't happen in categories or genres or in a progression of scholarly thought. I also like to say that the book goes from periphery to center, from elements of importance to elements of greater importance. So part one is, I confess, a bit of theory, a series of essayettes about aspects of the art form. They embrace quite a range, from which I'd like to extract just two principles this evening. The first has to do with something I think we tend to take for granted without considering its implications, and that is how our senses absorb opera, particularly that it is ear-led, eye-confirmed, or should be. And the second is what I call the chain of encounter. It runs from creator to interpreter to critic to receptor, each of whom creates and interprets in turn and passes along what he or she has received from the preceding one. This sequence is hierarchical. The creator's up there at the top and belongs there because the creator does what none of the others do, ventures out into the infinite field of phenomena to carve out a particular field of play. Therefore, he or she gets to determine the boundaries of that field and the rules of play within it. It's good to also note that the second interpreters, the ones we usually call interpreters, are nowadays subdivided into bosses, directors and conductors, and workers, the performers. And who gets to decide what among them, and on what basis, perhaps needs some reassessment. A little later, I propose a code of ethics for the second interpreter bosses. It's really simple. 1, the interpretive artist should consider himself bound by the hierarchy of the chain of encounter. He is not at the top. 2, he should proceed according to the principles of something I call actualism. That's explained elsewhere in the book. And 3, if he wishes to be considered a creator, he should write something. Probably needless to say, this chain is disrespected and the code is violated in whole or in part, more often than not. Which leads me to the show that got me started on the book to begin with. That was Robert Wilson's production of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. So I call this chapter Bob Does Dick. Wilson does things like putting his performers into a slow motion stasis that robs them of any agency, detaching the work from its time and place, and by means of his striking abstract visuals, turning opera into an eye-led, ear-befuddled form. Because you can't figure out what on earth this music is doing accompanying those slow-mo pictures. Beyond that, he articulates a few principles we'll be meeting again. One is that he wants a theater of clarity in which the audience is free to think without all this emotionalism. Also, that instead of binding together the work's elements, he prefers to separate them or even oppose them for the sake of seeing each more clearly. Think about it. Here's a guy, very smart, very talented, who's directing opera, but wants to be free of emotionalism, and who believes in separating a work's crucial elements, the music from the action, say, or the music from the words, which is to say that in this opera, he opposes the creator's central aesthetic. Wagner, after all, spent his life in search of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the integration of all production elements into a unified whole that is also bonded with the work itself as revealed in the text. Now along comes Bob, who thinks it's not only okay, but downright desirable to disassemble the creative genius's work and then make use of it to contradict him. It's supposed to be okay because of one more principle, which is that Bob, as a creative, independent artist, may make any use he wishes of Lohengrin, just as a fine artist assembles a collage out of found materials. The book says a great deal more about Bob and his Lohengrin, but I'll have to leave him there with these remarkable assertions, which he is far from alone in making. Keep them in mind, though, especially that notion of a separation of elements. By a stroke of luck, Lohengrin was almost immediately followed by a production by the visiting Mariinsky opera of Tchaikovsky's Mazeppa. This was a retro revival that reproduced the original 19th century set and costume designs and choreography, and it made a tremendous impact. This meant that I had in hand, by way of contrast, a production that was not only representational and pictorial, but that took it as a given that the creator's specifications were to be taken seriously, and that it was supposed to advocate for the work's manifest intentions, not refute them. So I use my Mazeppa chapter to argue that when we don't have to leap over the little brain barriers of metaphor or abstraction, or work on solving riddles of meaning as we go, we receive performance in a more direct, visceral way. After a little sidestep to talk about the enhancements, audio amplification and surtitles, which are intended to make performance more immediate, but in my opinion do nothing of the sort, I return to production itself, with two chapters called Here and Now and There and Then. Here and Now deals with operas we call modern, either because of the musical language they employ or just because they're relatively recent. And There and Then with productions of the standard repertory. As you can imagine, most of that deals with directorial concepts, but toward the end I'm forced to observe that in contemporary operatic practice, design, or what we call production values, has actually claimed the right to define the interpretive field. And while earlier efforts to elevate spectacle over music and action have been associated with frivolity and decadence, ours is asserted to be serious and advanced. Meaning is embedded in design. The mere mise en scène that does not aspire to some commentary or declaration of its own is these days a disrespected curio. And I quote from a book called Believing in Opera by the English critic Thomas Sutcliffe. He says first that design is supposed to encapsulate the meaning and the philosophical meaning of the production. Not the work, the production. And next, that in order to qualify as an act for the present context, interpretation must consist of criticism in action. In other words, performance and production should not advocate for the work, but critique it. Now, I'm not going to feign shock these days at this claim, but it's really a stunning reversal of the interpreter's role. It's derived mainly from misapplied principles of epic theater laid down by Bertolt Brecht, who was also a go-to source for that idea of a separation of elements, for both of which he had his reasons as they apply to his own plays, but which are inimical to works like those of our operatic canon. Sutcliffe also reproduces a 1908 essay on theater reform by the great Viennese designer Ernst Roller, which ends with a plea for a theater where what happens on stage frankly signifies, rather than being or pretending to be. That's a thought that comes from semiotics, the study of signs, of the world as a system of signifiers and signifieds. That gets us directly into part 3, which is entitled The Intellectual Background. And remember, everybody, we're working our way from the pretty important to the really important. This part is in 2 chapters. The first is called Merci à tous, mais ça suffit, je crois, which means thanks to all, but that will do, I think. Because we have this remarkable fact that much of what we're seeing in production these days is coming not from the body of knowledge held by artists of opera or theater or music, but from the worlds of lit-crit theorists and philosophers, particularly French ones and their followers. So we encounter ideas like the endless deferral of meaning, intertextuality, phonocentrism, and think about that one in relation to opera, the death of narrative, and perhaps most famously, the death of the author. And all this is intertwined with another French notion, this one derived from cinema, the theory of the auteur, which, now that the author is dead, provides someone to take his place. Voila, the director, who can now range across both contemporary and historical cultures, picking and choosing whatever serves his or her personal agenda. And while all this stimulating thinking and writing has been going on, France has produced precious little by way of new operas or of singers in that nation's once great tradition. Here's a nice quote from none other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Quote, "Thus, as soon as Greece became full of sophists and philosophers, she no longer had any famous musicians or poets. In cultivating the art of convincing, that of arousing the emotions was lost." Unquote. I don't know if it happened just that way in old Athens, but it has certainly occurred in the France of our time. 1 second. Why is it, though, that for a century our opera rights have not been able to replenish our canonical repertoire? The reasons advanced usually have to do with 2 world wars and their aftermaths, and or the harmonic revolution in musical language. Can't argue with those as plausible candidates, and I think they're interconnected. But I prefer to ask the question another way. How is it that during what I call E19, the extended 19th century, I stole it from Eric Hobsbawm, and especially from around 1830 or 35 on, opera rights generated this staggering body of acknowledged masterworks and enduring popular favorites, something that, so far as I can tell, is unparalleled in stage history, save possibly back there in old Athens. I think it had to do not so much with musical factors, changing styles, developing harmonic language, as with the story these works tell over and over again. This is an idea I've been developing and writing about from time to time, ever since reading a book years ago called Love in the Western World by, yes, another Frenchman, Denis de Rougemont. His book is about the cultural centrality of the myth of Tristan and Isolde. And as I read it, I began thinking, yes, right, that's what it is, but wait a minute. It's also what that opera is, and that one, and that one, and that one. And pretty soon I realized that this tale, in one form or another, was the central plot of the entire E19 repertoire. Here it is in skeleton form, and now I'll read from the book. By reason of dispossession or other disconnection, a male protagonist cannot assume his presumed rightful place in the social scheme. This injustice is the flashpoint of the plot. It drives the action even when our attention is on a female predicament. The outcast hero falls instantly and obsessively in love with a woman identified through family or title with the very situation from which he is excluded. This forbidden woman returns his love. An antagonist opposes the fated couple by reason of his station, which is often that claimed by the protagonist, or his own attachment, romantic or familial, to the woman. The decisive clash between the male claimants, in the course of which the woman's fate is determined, and in which she usually plays a catalytic role, is the denouement of the plot. In the handful of comedies among these operas, the conflict ends in social accommodation. In the far more numerous tragedies, it leads to the death of one or usually both members of the protagonist couple. I really wish we had time for me to tell you much more about the medieval origins of this plot, about the culture of courtly love, the Albigensian crusade, and the figure of the Fedi, the banished, dispossessed nobleman turned rebel, and his high-born lady love. Or to take you through enough of the 75 to 100 operas of the core repertory to show you how pervasive this story is and why it meant so much to the opera rights of E19 and their audiences. But I guess you'll have to read the book for that. I do want to note that though this protagonist couple was in rebellion, what they were really seeking was inclusion. They weren't trying to overthrow the old order, but to attain what they saw as their deserved place in it. And the only way to achieve that was through marriage. If the dispossessed outsider and his forbidden lover could marry, he would regain his lost place in the patrilineal succession, and all would be well. E19 tells us that this very seldom worked out. What this amounted to then was an overarching meta-narrative, a story of agreed-upon urgency for both the opera rights and their audiences, and whose romantic and individualistic elements made it great to sing about. The originality and ingenuity of the music it inspired kept it from seeming redundant, though in fact it was. That, above all, is what E19 had, and what we haven't been able to find for ourselves ever since. Now comes the heart of my book, the chapters on performing itself. The first of these concerns developments in conducting and orchestral playing. And, once again cheating horribly, I guess the main points here are: 1, a shift in sonority from darker to brighter, from a lower center of gravity to a higher one. 2, a striving for greater clarity and the bringing out of detail and inner voices, and that would be, come to think of it, a separation of elements, as opposed to a more homogeneous sound. And 3, a preference for sheer technical expertise and aesthetic qualities over involvement with onstage doings and dramatic qualities. I devote considerable space to the career and influence of James Levine, with Valery Gergiev as a sort of counterpunching position, as representative of these qualities and a couple of his own. Happily, all this was written well before the sad happenings of the past few years. Singing. Here's the single most important element of operatic performance, the one which, when fused with dramatic action and with words, is constitutive of opera. It also happens to be one of my 2 home disciplines. We have to start with the fact, and it is a fact, that for some 40 to 50 years we've been suffering a lack of voices that can really do justice to the greatest roles in the greatest operas of E19, or even those of Mozart, Handel, et al. In the big opera houses we have. Let me read you my favorite anecdotal example of this downsizing from the days when I covered the Met regularly. And again, I quote from the book. In the fall of 1968, I attended a performance of Adriana le Couvreur with Franco Corelli as Maurizio. Less than 2 weeks later, I returned for Placido Domingo's Met debut in the same part. Having seen Domingo in several roles of the New York City Opera, I was sure the debut would be successful, and so it was. Smooth, warm singing with a fine glow and quite sufficient resonance for the house. Still, here was a perfect comparison. Same role, same hall, same sets, same orchestra and conductor, all heard from the same seats and only a few days apart. And I was left with this equation. 1 Domingo equals 2/3 of a Corelli, unquote. In other words, our leading tenor in spiccio and dramatic roles for some 30 years after that performance, and mind you, an excellent singer, represented a marked falling off in vocal presence. This falling off has been across the board, covering all voice types, and has happened in my lifetime. I can personally attest to it, and I do. It puts quite a crimp in our efforts at Wagner or Verdi, Strauss or Puccini. The thing that more than any other makes their operas transcendent, that sweeps us away, that makes the old story emotionally compelling, simply isn't there. But another big change, a shift in how people sing, that we can mark on recordings that take us back to the turn of the last century, had already taken place. I've devised a two-column way of conveying this in non-technical language. In the left column, stage life, voices that are bright, lean, and taut. Over on the right, those that are dark, plump, and loose. Of course, these are rough, overlapping categories, and in general, the better the singer, the closer to center he or she is. Still, even most of the great voices fall a bit on one side or the other. And I set up comparisons of singers who are as far left or right as they can be and still be great. For instance, among high sopranos, Luisa Tetrazzini versus Joan Sutherland. Or, among dramatic tenors, Lauritz Melchior or Giovanni Martinelli versus John Vickers. You get the idea. And here's the thing. Beginning in the years just before World War II, but then gaining momentum after it, there's a perceptible slide from left to right. From brighter, leaner, tauter towards darker, plumper, looser. There's no mistaking it. Then, around 1970, give or take a few years, we had this sharp decline in vocal caliber, to the point where even by gathering together all the world's best singers for their roles, we cannot cast La Forza del Destino, say, or Götterdämmerung, at what used to be the presumed international level. That means, in turn, that instruments that should be cultivated as voices that are essentially lyric in caliber are so light that one is hard put to categorize them as operatic at all, or are pushed into the spinto and dramatic categories faute de mieux. Naturally, I investigate this. And while there are many contributory causes I explore, and I've been turning to them periodically in my blog in posts called Before the First Lesson, two things really stick out. One is technical, and that is what I call chest voice chastity, most easily heard in female voices, but in fact operated in the male as well. The other is socio-techno-cultural, and the synchronicity is inescapable. The generation that passed its shelf date around the date I mentioned earlier, 1970, singers, in other words, who were born between 1910 or so and 1930 or so, were the last to grow up free from the dominance of the microphone and obliged to speak up and sing out without it, not just on stage, but in life. Acting. And we shouldn't really discuss it apart from singing, because singing and acting should be bonded, inseparable. In fact, the quest for this bond has been going on for at least a couple of centuries. It was sought after even within the rhetorical tradition that reigned during E19, but particularly since the advent of what I term the modern acting sensibility. The problem, essentially, is that there's quite a gap between that sensibility and the rhetoric that is written into the scores of classical operas, a rhetoric that has to be fulfilled. In the book, I give extended attention to Walter Felsenstein's attack on the problem with his Komische Oper in what was then East Berlin, and some to the admirable early New York City opera productions of Frank Corsaro, with whom I studied back in the 60s. Both produced some remarkable results I talk about, but neither was quite able to attain the fusion of modern acting with great voiced singing, or, except in one instance I cite, something else they said they were after, the creative independence of the performer. Usually when the gap is transcended, it is by an individual performer, and documented examples are very rare. So I was excited when I came across one. Neil Chikoff's performance of the role of Eleazar in Halévy's La Juive. He achieved everything that could be achieved in this fascinating role by a singing actor with a good voice that was still not of the grand dramatic type that had formerly succeeded with it. And not only was there soon a DVD of the production and of a documentary about Chikoff's work on the character, but there also existed substantial audio recording and even some video on old Vitaphone shorts of the Eleazar of Martinelli, the direct successor to Caruso himself in this part. I take us into the weeds with La Juive, talking about its origins back in the Paris of 1835, in the very time and place of another momentous change in singing, the birth of the modern dramatic tenor, which was a sort of masculine empowerment, with all that that meant for singing right up till our current downsizing. And I try to show in detail how a modern singing actor like Chikoff might construct his character's tortured backstory and develop his specific moment-to-moment actions and express them with his vocal means, and to compare that with how a great artist of the older tradition, like Martinelli, approached the same problems. And they are both wonderful, yet they remain overlapping but essentially complementary. We still don't quite have the combo platter. In these chapters, I pay a lot of attention to the virtues of the older rhetorical approach, especially as championed by the masters of elocution and of the rhetoric of gesture, and to the evolution of that into the modern acting sensibility, most prominently through the work of Stanislavski and his successors, and into the modern directorial function with Max Reinhardt taken as a paradigm, both Stanislavski and Reinhardt deeply engaged with opera, by the way. Then we hit a section called Down the Post Road, which takes us through the work of the literally revolutionary anti-Stanislavskian Vsevolod Meyerhold, working in the Soviet contemporaneously with the young Brecht in Germany, and from somewhat the same perspective, and again, very involved with opera, with his from the outside in biomechanical theories about acting, and his assertion, and I think he may have been the first to make this claim, that the director is fully co-equal with the creator and entitled to write his text anew. And from there, on into the moonlight landscape of post-dramatic theater, a term coined by the German critic Hans-Thies Lehmann, who certainly knows his way around that planet, where not only are all authors dead ones, but where all narrative and all dramatic oppositions are also among the dear departed, along with psychology itself, except, of course, for one psychology, the directors. There's a long essay review, the only real review in the book, of the ecstatically received production of Borodin's Prince Igor by the satanically gifted Dmitry Chernyakov, and then a series of updates, since after all, by now it's 16, 17 years later, which also includes a few new topics, like the tragédie lyrique of Lully and Charpentier, or the unusual technical path taken by Jonas Kaufmann. And finally, there's a chapter called The Dream On Company, so called because whenever I start to expound on it, eyelids droop, and I hear something like, yeah, right, dream on. But while it is a fantasy, it's actually intended to realistically set forth what would be required to tackle all these problems with some hope of artistic success. And so I talk about money. There's even a rough line item budget, and the economics of the performing arts, and our sad history of trying to get them recognized as public goods, all of which I learned enough about to make me an educated layman during the period when I worked for the music foundation I discussed at the beginning and sat on a couple of boards. It wasn't all pretty, but it was educational. Well, I can't end with the dismal science, so let me close with this. I like the attitude of the Russian film director Alexander Sokurov. I've seen only 2 of his many films, Russian Ark and Alexandra. They're very different in style and subject, both fascinating and humanizing, and both, incidentally, with operatic connections. The final sequence of Russian Ark, a film famous for its single-track shot technique, shows the grand ballroom of the Hermitage in full aristocratic swing, with Gergiev leading the mazurka from Eugene Onegin. And in Alexandra, Galina Vishnevskaya plays an old woman making her way to Chechnya on a freight train to visit her grandson on the front lines of the war there. Speaking of Russia's troubled times, and when are they not troubled, Sokurov says, we're not irrevocably fated to be civilized. Every time we have to prove it. We have to pass the exam that we can be civilized. That's right, I think. That's the task. And it's not Russia's alone. Thanks for listening.
Bring your water over.
Oh, thank you.
What a pleasure to have you here in the Opera Center. And I had no idea that you were at the first Opera America meeting in Seattle in 1970. Opera America is approaching its 50th anniversary. We're getting ready for it, planning it now 2020. Right. And I don't know how many people there are who were at that first meeting. So
I remember a lot of them. They were the directors of the regional opera company.
So we're going to have to sit down and talk about that. I have to get you on tape about that first.
Love to do that.
That would be just great.
Sure. In fact, I can probably get out the docket memorandum that I wrote.
Oh, I would love to even publish that. That would be such fun to publish in our, if we were to do a special publication for the 50th anniversary. How marvelous that would be. I am filled with comments and questions and reactions to what you said tonight and to the book. And in reading it, you raised so many questions that I wrestle with as head of Opera America about where is opera in this 21st century cultural milieu, and what has changed more, the world around us or opera, and what do we wish to turn the clock back to? But I'm going to follow some of the questions that I had prepared and interweave a little bit. First of all, I just want to appreciate the title of the book, Opera as Opera. Because so often, and you argue it so well in the book, so often we talk about opera as this plus this plus this. You know, it's a play set to music. It's all of these other things. And you just make a really cogent argument for no, opera is opera, you know, and it is not this sequence of additives, but it is its own art form. And it's very affirming. You make an argument at the beginning of the book about, you said this is a serious book about opera in performance, feeling that the discussion of performance has been given short shrift. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I think that's true. I think people write reviews, of course. We've got a lot of that. But most of the serious writing that I see about opera these days is about text. It's musicological, or it's an investigation of themes, and it's not really about what goes on in performance. You get books about one phase of it. Some of the people that I showed this book to early on said, well, you've got 4 books in one here. And it's true. And one reason is that I thought all that belonged between 2 covers. We've got a discussion of this aspect over here and of this aspect over here, and they're very good books, and they contribute to our thinking about things, but it never puts together the picture of opera, particularly as it relates to performance. And I think, I don't know how you feel, Mark, but I think the basic standard of criticism of performance has declined, and there's much less of it with the failures of so many newspapers, so many magazines of the kind that I wrote for years ago. There simply isn't anywhere near as much of it as there used to be. And it seems to me that the set of standards that critics used to feel needed to be applied to performance has sunk, at least in the mainstream press. There are things online where there are knowledgeable people applying those standards sometimes. But that's really what I meant to get at, was that this would be a book that would, without slighting questions of text or of other aspects of the art form, would get down to what really happens. And I know that I go into detail in a way that not everyone will follow me in terms of the acting and vocal and musical small events that are really what makes up interpretation. And whether we are consciously aware of it or not, as we watch and listen, are having the subliminal effect on us of reaching us or not. It's made up of tiny things, choices, and little bits of execution that either succeed or don't, or get through us, to us or don't. And I wanted to get into that in a way that would not totally put off more general readers, but would show them, look, this is what's really at stake here. And let's talk about what's really involved in making performance happen, which is the only way opera really comes to life. Otherwise, opera is just a form of literature. We have scores, but and it's not like plays. Anybody can read a play. So the existence of literature in drama is still a very live thing that most people have access to. Not the same as performance, but it's there, it's accessible. To a score, the vast majority of people who are going to opera or are candidates for going to opera have no access to it. They're not musicians. So it doesn't exist in that sense. It only comes to life when people actually perform it. So,
I found it interesting too, and I'm probably reading into your thoughts some, again, because the book was so stimulating around the things that I wrestle with. And the more a singer is given today in terms of direction or concept or scenic effect, the less that singer is free to just give what he or she has to give.
correct.
And in the old days of American opera, if you would just hang a wrinkled palm tree or pyramid, you could call it Aida, but the singers were then left to just give what they had because all they had was a wrinkled pyramid.
Yes, and I'm not in favor of wrinkled pyramids.
Right.
I saw a number of them.
They should all be ironed at least.
Well, when I was first going to the Met, many of the productions were still in the sets designed by Joseph Urban, a great designer, but they were in pathetic condition.
Right.
I mean, Tristan, Act 3, you could see what we used to call, I don't know whether this term is used anymore, a Dutchman on the cyc, a cloth patch to match the blue of the sky, only it didn't match. Right. So, anyway, yes, I mean, I'm not in favor of going back to that, and I don't argue against the idea of integrated production with somebody ultimately responsible for what goes on up there. But in the training of singing actors, we've gotten, I think, into a situation where there's really not much attention paid to waking up their own, and of course, back 2 or 3 generations, we had many, many more singers native to the cultures that they were singing in. Their own languages, they didn't have to be taught that. And that was a fairly natural means of expression to them. Now, with the internationalization of opera, and certainly here in America, we have the requirement to try to teach everything at a remove from the sources, as I mentioned in my talk. We're generationally now far removed from the cultures that produced those interpretive instincts. just the way they produce them now for singers of music theater or jazz or...
In my conversation on this stage with Stephanie Blythe, she was chatting about the importance of recital in her life, recital giving, because she said, in the recital, I choose the music, I choose what to wear, I choose where to move my hands, and that she feels so much more empowered as an artist when she's doing a recital than when she's doing an opera where the designer has given her the costume and the director is telling her where to move, and how important the recital aspect of her career is to keep her stage energy alive even when she's in staged opera.
That sounds absolutely right. And the other thing is that if there is an artist who would like to do his own work on a role, he or she finds it useless when they come to the actual beginning of a production, because the concept of the production and the straitjacket that the performer has been put in won't allow him or her to go in anything like that direction. They're only left to obey. Kaufman talks about this. I mentioned in the book an interview with Marie Dorigny. It appeared in the New York Review of Books. And he talks about time after time having the experience of asking questions of a director when something doesn't make a bit of sense to him. Things don't hook up with anything about the character as he understands it. And the director will tell him, well, don't be so literal. And Kaufman says, you know, when you encounter time after time where all the arrows seem to point in one direction, but then we don't go in that direction, what are we left to do? And the very strong implication is that what you do is you pull yourself in. You try to, and he even says, he tries to think back to the last traditional production of the opera that he was in or that he saw to give him some idea of what he thinks he should try to do. So he literally seals himself off from what's going on around him in order to have something make sense to it. Now that's a ridiculous position for an artist to be in.
In the book, and early on, you draw a distinction, and I didn't follow the whole argument, opera as drama versus opera as theater.
Well, I guess I think that drama is the literary form, in effect, the work as it is written. Opera as theater is that form theatricalized, taken into where we actually put it into action. I think that's all nothing profound.
So opera as drama, because sometimes you capitalize the word work, you put a capital W to the work. So opera as drama more or less is the work W capitalized.
I guess I mean by doing that, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, and maybe I'm not totally consistent with it. I originally, at least, was trying to make a distinction between times when I would talk about it capitalized, initial W, and times with a small w, because by initial cap W, I meant kind of the work as we have it in general understanding. We talk about works like Otello is a great work, as if the thing was kind of floating out here in the atmosphere somewhere, and it isn't. It's in our common understanding, though. We take in, I talk about having tapestries that we each weave of our experiences of a given opera. We go to them and we stitch in what we got from this time and what we got from the next time. And that becomes a kind of our ongoing relationship to that work. And then many other people, devotees, have many of those same experiences with the work, and large parts of the tapestry would look the same. But then they also have different experiences because they are not the same people and they interpret it differently and receive it differently. But the idea of having it in common, that we understand what we mean when we say Otello is a great work, I guess I mean that. And of course, in some of the modern and postmodern theory that I get into a little bit in the book, there's a denial that there is any such thing as a work, that there is only a relationship between a reader or a receptor.
And a text.
That's right. That's right.
I want this. This is a cluster of questions and thoughts. You talk about today's big theaters and voices being able to fill today's big theaters. And I am sometimes, I wonder if the big theater isn't part of the big problem. The Metropolitan Opera House today has a seating capacity that's not much more than the old Metropolitan Opera House, but probably a volume that's twice the size.
The cubic footage is quite a bit larger, right?
and
the stage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you go to the big houses of Europe, Scala, and it feels intimate by comparison,
yeah.
or the San Carlo in Naples. And, is our problem, I think of Vikram Seth, who said that the natural scale of music is chamber. And if we think about Mozart and Rossini and the Donizetti and the early Verdi, these works are so much more potent and vibrant in a theater like the ones for which they were written. Mm-hmm. Is some of the problem of opera today the theaters of today?
I think some of the problem of some opera is, yes. And all that's true, and I buy into that, particularly with respect to many of the kinds of works that you were talking about. On the other hand, if you had one of the Donizetti operas with the cast that you had at La Scala in the 50s, Callas, Simeonato, even the men, Gianni Raimondi, Nicola Rossi Lemeni, we wouldn't be complaining too much. Those performances would have impact. And I think about this very often because there are many singers that I heard at the New York City Opera when it was at the New York City Center, and then when it was at the State Theater, and who I heard in the old Met, and then in the new Met. And the comparison that I draw between Corelli and Domingo, that happened in the new Met. And there was no problem with Tebaldi and Corelli in the new Met. And there was no problem with the person, well, I wouldn't say there's no problem, but there wasn't a significant problem with the personnel of the New York City Opera in the 60s, in the New York State Theater either, even though we all know that was not, acoustically, is not a terribly favorable venue. It's the singers. Now, I wish the Metropolitan Opera House was a little smaller, and it was supposed to be. When those designs were initially drawn up, I remember Herman Krawitz telling me about this when I went through the Opera House before it opened, and I went through Hard Hat and looked at and wrote a piece about it. And he told me that there were several vertical rows along the outer aisles that were not there in the plans originally drawn up, and that the management of the Met took a look at it and says, oh, we got to have more seats over here, we got to have more capacity. They were thinking about economics. So 3 or 4 more rows down the side aisles, it fattened out more than it was originally intended to, and that alone would have made some difference. But acoustically, there isn't that much difference. I heard so many singers go from the old Met to the new Met. There was not a significant difference. I heard some in all 4 of those houses, the City Opera at City Center, then in the State Theater, then at the old Met, then at the new Met, Cheryl Milnes, several others. And from venue to venue, yeah, there were little differences. And in a funny way, Milnes' voice, for example, actually sounded better in the new Met than it did in the State Theater. It opened out into the house a bit better.
You talk about, and I love your use of the E19, the extended 19th century, thinking of it as Mozart to Puccini, 1780 to 1925. And I sort of divide E19 into 2 parts, which is through about 1840.
So do I.
I heard you in the remarks and then afterward. And I think what is some of the trouble that we're having with the second part of E19, the fact that the world has changed so much, our social sensibilities have changed so much, that the works where women are victims, where everything goes on that is confused and it's the woman who is punished for it, as opposed to those smart Rossini women and smart Mozart women and smart Handel women, is part of it the way the world has changed, and the works from the second part of E19 just sit in an anachronistic space right now.
I understand what you're talking about. First of all, I don't quite buy the women as victim thing. I really like Catherine Clément's book, but it's pretty specious. If you take a body count, go through Verdi, go through Puccini, count up the dead bodies, the women and the men, and how they died, and the position that they're in the operas, and you're going to come out to a pretty close count. It's not to say that her arguments don't have some validity. They certainly do. And what you're saying about that shift, yes, that shift in social norms, in the relations between the sexes. I talk about the great masculine empowerment of Dupré and the advent of the modern dramatic tenor. That was a shift in how the sexes are perceived on the stage. Male excitement and rage and passion became magnified in a different way than it had been by the tenors of the old school. And that translated over into other voice types as well, as you know. Yeah. So sure, I think those things are true. I think chest voice chastity, which is in a way part of the same thing. It's subtracting the male component, the masculine component, from singing, or taking it down, downsizing it, in favor of the head voice. That has a big effect on how voices behave, how they project, how they endure. That and the microphone, I think those two things are the most important elements in the difficulty in singing. There are other difficulties in how we receive those operas. That's true. People may find that story unpalatable. It may not seem workable to them anymore. But it seems to me that in opera, it's very funny how it becomes workable all of a sudden when there's great singing. All of a sudden, it persuades you. You believe in it. You're moved by it. Whether you think you agree with it as a belief system or not. And I personally feel that that's what's happened more than any other single thing. You touch on something. I mean, the fact that there is that revival of the early E19, not to mention the Baroque,
right.
Not all that, the repertory taken as a worldwide thing has widened considerably. Yeah. And those operas demand different things than the late E19 operas do, for sure. And the things that they require, I use in the book the term skip over. Skip over voice. Voices that are compatible with what we think we know about earlier singing styles. I'm not totally convinced that we do, but the things we infer from it or project onto it. And a lot of contemporary writing, post-World War I writing, in the modern vein, chamber operas, and many operas where the vocal usages are more compatible with those.
Right.
And that's what's being trained as much as, I think, more than.
And I was speaking with someone from conservatory, and he suggested that one of the reasons it is hard to find singers who have that late E19 ability is they don't have much interest in the works or the characters, that there isn't a desire to inhabit those characters, the way there is a desire to inhabit the Countess or Cleopatra. So and of course, we're, all of this complex chicken or egg question, but that the degree to which some of the late E19 has become out of sync with contemporary sensibilities reduces the appetite of some singers to take on the music.
I absolutely know that that's true because I teach voice. So I can't tell you how many young women I've run into who don't want to do Norina. Mm-hmm. They don't want to, and they won't say why, but I know why. They don't like her.
Well, neither do I, to tell you the truth.
Well, but you see, to me now, that's where, to me, acting comes in. Because if you're an actor and you start to look at that character, what you ask yourself is, what predicament is this character in? Why does she behave the way she does? Why does she do these cruel things? Why does she seem to have fun with it? What's going on? Because that was considered a very modern opera in the day. It was a very contemporary feminist opera. And you start to look at, okay, what situation is she in? She's got this lover, Ernesto, who doesn't have a trade and doesn't have, she's got to get an inheritance. That's her situation. She's a widow. She can't get by in the world unless she finds some way to maneuver things around to where Ernesto will get the inheritance instead of this old guy being her protector and having to marry him. Now, that's a terrific predicament for a woman to be in. Why would even a contemporary woman have difficulty if she looks at it as an actress and does that kind of work on the role, seeing, oh my gosh, sure, I've got to find my way through to where I can manipulate these characters. We've got to set up something. And she's a very witty, sharp-minded, aggressive young woman who says in her opening aria, that is the way it is and the way it always has been, but I'm going to do something else. And I don't see any problem in that, and I try to explain this to some of the young women that I work with, and I get stonewalled about it. But to me, the solution is for them to go and learn how to be actresses. Learn how to analyze character, learn how to determine what the life situation of the character you're playing is, and follow through where the work takes you in trying to bring that character out where she comes out. So to me, that's I have arguments with that, yeah, frequently.
But interesting that you encounter it in your own studio of some resistance to the stories and the characters of the repertoire that we know so well, but that it is...
Now, I have to say, I don't encounter it too often with the great roles of Wagner and Verdi. I don't run into that very much. Less, actually. Anyway.
The concept of repeatability.
Yes.
And you talk about the absence today of repeatable operas. And of course, we always talk about a few exceptions, but for the rule, I certainly agree with you that so much of the new work that we see has not been repeated either in some instances as much as it deserves, but in other instances because it doesn't deserve it. But the concept of repeatability didn't really enter our world until the middle of E19, even late E19. So why is this repeatability a force that is desirable for you?
For me, because you can't have repertory without it. I mean, repertory is the thing you're talking about. That's what became the standard fashion for how opera houses operate in the period that you're talking about, and had been much less so before. That there would be an actual canon of works that extended through generations and from season to season to season and would be revived. And as long as you had casts that could really measure up to the roles, could go from season to season, and people would go back, as perhaps you, I don't know, but certainly I, used to do in my youth. I'd go back to the same opera 3 or 4 times in a season because there would be 3 or 4 different casting combinations that I was interested in. And they would tell me different things about the work and give me different thrills. And I think repertory is important. It's not written into stone. It's not part of the natural order of things. But without it, we don't have institutions of continuity where you can have a true company. You can't have a company unless you have an agreed upon body of work that the company is going to work on. It can't be the same as in theater, where we unfortunately don't have a big national repertory theater for classic plays. I wish we did, but we don't. And if you're producing operas or plays just one at a time, one production at a time, you can get some wonderful work. You know, maybe you can get better work on a single time basis. Mike Nichols used to say he hated repertory. Everyone was always slightly miscast. And for the kind of director he was, that was very important. He wanted precision in that kind of work. Now, in opera, it's a little bit different because the casting has to be from the voice first before anything else. But if you don't have a repertory, we are going to have the canon, which I am really dedicated to trying to maintain.
So you wouldn't turn the clock back to 1825 and Rossini turning out 2 operas a year?
If we had Rossini here and he was turning out 2 operas a year, I'd be really happy.
Because we really don't have a canon until we have copyright. Because the composers...
That's interesting.
The composers were living off commissions.
Yes.
And once you get copyright into it, Verdi slows down, everything calms down.
Right, yes. I'm in favor of copyright also.
Yeah. So, I look back and you read the Rossini biographies and all of the theaters and all of the works they're producing by composers we've never heard of.
That's right.
And you're going to the opera probably 2 or 3 times a week, seeing different works, and there's no repeatability. So for you, you feel the greatest comfort and institutional value in the company that can perform a canon as opposed to that constant churn.
Not necessarily opposed. I don't see why you can't have some of both. I don't see why you can't have some great institutional repertory companies. And in fact, we kind of do. I mean, in this country, we have 3 or 4 big repertory theaters with something approaching full seasons. And then we have a lot of regional companies and smaller companies who produce on a production by production basis. Now, they don't mostly produce new work. And that's a whole other thing. Is it because new works of quality and audience appeal are not being written? Or is it because of an audience resistance? There's so much that we can talk about there. But I mean, see, here we've created this body of work. I don't think there's any body of work to parallel this. Do you? I mean, the whole body of operas that was written, we can start with Mozart, then there's a little lag, kind of, where we have, Der Freischütz and Fidelio and a few, and Will argue with me, I suppose, because he's just finished doing Simon Mayer's Medea, and there are a lot of worthy works. Among the kinds of works you're talking about that theaters did when that system prevailed. But we go from Mozart, and we had Gluck and Handel, wonderful, great composers who composed great works. And then we arrive at 1830, 1835, and Donizetti, and the late Rossini, and then Verdi, and then Puccini, and Wagner, and Strauss. That body of work taken together, similar to the body of symphonic work.
Absolutely.
That was created for the orchestral repertory. And if an orchestra to me, and a conductor, can't be happy and find itself revitalized by playing the entire canon of work, symphonic work that begins with Haydn and goes through Mozart, Schubert, Schumann, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler, if they can't make seasons out of that and the and the Russian works, and the French works, and the American works that feed into it, and Vaughan Williams and Elgar. And if somehow they can't make up and stay awake and revitalize those works, that's the idea. To be repeatable, something also has to be renewable. Those are the two words I apply, renewable and repeatable. Then you can have a repertory. You have to have the performers to do that, and they have to go and do it. They do have to renew it. Yeah, you don't want to hear the 10th Beethoven Fifth in the last, but actually how many have you heard recently? How many Beethoven Fifths have actually been done in this city in the last 5 years? Go count them up. I don't think there have been very many. And most of the ones you hear, yeah, I don't really care if I hear that again real soon. But great conductors and orchestras that are on their toes, if you perform that work, you're having a great experience. And I think the same is true with opera.
Before I turn the audience back over to you, I want to chat a little bit about new work, because your book, as you say, has been written over 17 years, and certainly the tempo of new work creation has picked up a great deal in those 17 years. And almost every American opera company is producing some American work every season. And that's a fairly recent attainment, where American opera figures in every opera company season. Do you feel that over the last 17 years of your reflection on this, that there is more creativity that you appreciate and that you want to see develop as we go forward? Are you pleased with the not only quantity but quality of what you see coming out of the studios today?
Some of it, and I'm not in the best position to talk about this. Here I am in New York, and I don't get around the country a lot, and I don't go to performance as much as I once did. I'm really interested in seeing some of the composers that I've heard about develop farther and hear more of their work. One piece that I mention in the book, and another one that I saw fairly recently down at the Prototype Festival, Written on Skin and Dog Days. Now, those are both highly talented works. Written on Skin is a chamber opera. It cannot be in a repertory of grand opera. I mean, it could be, but even the State Opera was not a good venue for that piece, although they did well with it. Dog Days was done down at the Prototype Festival. One of my students was singing one of the leading roles, so that's the main reason I was there. I thought it was a very talented piece. I thought it had some power. I'm interested in hearing more of that person's work. The pieces that have made their way to the Met have been one dreary experience after another for me. I'm going again. I'm going to see Marnie.
Sure.
And I took a year off last year. I gave myself a sabbatical from seeing the Met's new opera of the year. But I'll go back this year, and I will keep an open mind. And I wrote in my blog about the Adès piece. He's a very talented composer. I don't think his work so far, what I've seen of it, is terribly repeatable. I don't think people will be breaking down the doors to hear other singers sing those roles, to hear that piece again and again. So I don't think really they're going to be joining there'll be people that might revive them from time to time, and they have their points of interest. But that's kind of, Al Hubei, remember Al Hubei? Al he was an assistant general manager he worked up from Usher into the front office at the Met. And Al used to be he was used as a predictor. The company would go to him and they'd say, Al, we're thinking of doing this opera and this opera and this opera next year. How are they going to do at the box office? And Al would produce these predictions, which turned out to be on the nose. I mean, like within $10 or something of what a given work would produce in a given year. Taking in mind, I suppose, the casts that were available. And he did that year after year. And in his thinking, operas got divided up into several categories. There's category one, the opera that can be performed year after year after year, and casts can come and go, and people will still come, and it'll do well. Category number two, the operas that can be brought around every 5, 7 years, if carefully cast, and people will enjoy them, and maybe they can be brought back the next year if they have a big success. Category three, the operas that you can revive every 10, maybe every person's lifetime. Everyone should see it once. And then there are further categories of operas that really should never be done.
Never see.
And a repertory theater has to kind of think that way. Now, I'm all in favor of as much activity out around that as we can possibly have, because where are the repertory theaters going to get their new works from? But you see, so much of it is being written, as you say, in a chamber venue.
Yeah.
Now, that's fine. I'm not against chamber operas. But both of those works I mentioned were such, could not be inflated to grand opera proportions, could not hold their own in that opera house or any big opera house, and I don't think would be both renewable and repeatable in the context of a repertory of canonical works. You've always got this comparison going on.
Right.
The anxiety of influence that Harold Bloom talked about. Here's this, and I wonder sometimes how much World War I actually, it was enormously disruptive to culture, obviously, but there was also this recent presence of Verdi, Wagner, Puccini, Strauss, those guys, and the works they produced within a period of 30 years or so, that just loomed over everything, over all new efforts to write anything. And I sometimes wonder, I credit all of the big social upheavals and the crash of civilization and all of that, absolutely. But I sometimes wonder, suppose that hadn't happened. Suppose there hadn't been any First World War. Would Schoenberg have written the music he wrote? Would the languages have changed so much? How much of it was composer just feeling, geez, I can't do that. I can't compete with that. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but the thought sneaks in there sometimes.
I think it's a topic for another book.
Another, yes.
They've heard enough from me. I'm going to turn the audience over to you for questions.
Oh, they're not going to grill you. They're going to grill
No,
me.
and I get off easy tonight. Such a
Marc,
pleasure.
thank you.
Really, such a pleasure. An honor.
So, folks, don't feel obligated, but if you do have questions, I'd be delighted to do my best. Anyone? Sir.
Opera's theater, opera's drama, opera's performance. I have to say that when I was in London, I saw Das Rheingold in English in the stage performance, and I have to say the opera went by in a twinkle. I could understand.
Went by what, I'm sorry?
In a twinkle.
In a twinkle.
I understood every word they said. It made total sense. There was no long curves, as we said. Then I noticed on Broadway, Osborne, I think it was, for La Boheme, and when asked why he didn't do La Boheme in English, said it didn't sound right. Verdi and Wagner and all those were very insistent that when their operas traveled to different countries, they were done in the language of the country. Yet there seems to be great resistance to doing opera in English, and I don't mean at the Met, which is a museum house, but in general, or in the City Opera or any place else. What are your thoughts about that? And how much do you think that is detrimental to people accepting? Also, one more thing, in terms of singers, American singers growing up,
Right.
and being forced to communicate in decent diction in English and communicate in that.
Yes, that can be a real value.
Yeah.
Although I can tell you that when I was a young singer growing up, having to sing Mozart operas in the Martin translations was not a joy. I would have given anything to be able to sing the Count or what in Italian. Look, I'm an old-time opera devotee. I grew up listening to recordings of great singers and going to opera in a time when we had great singers of all the nationalities of the major operatic cultures here performing for us in those languages. And part of what drew me in, I learned languages because of opera. And that seems to me to always be the agon. Yes, there are great values to be derived from the direct reception of the text, even if it's not quite the text in the same order from the singer to the audience, and the singer having to realize, oh, I have to make sense in my own language. Here I go. Those can be tremendous values. In the book, I talk a lot about Felsenstein, who made his own translations and was very insistent that these are the authentic words of and he made very literal translations. He managed to fit almost in the same word order. I mean, almost. And for the audiences at the Komische Oper and for the singers at the Komische Oper, very few of whom were what we would call really top-flight singers, but they were highly talented singing actors. That's a kind of theater that he produced, which I think had great value. But there's always that conflict between wanting that immediacy of communication against the great difficulty, of finding really good translations, finding translations that are poetic, that lift us up, that don't just bring us down to some colloquial level, and yet which get across what we're the meaning. And on the other hand, the fact that it doesn't sound as good, nearly always. Basil Ehrman, that was his production, that's right. For a time at the Met back in the 50s, we did have alternate productions of Bohème in English and in Italian. And the NBC TV opera used to come on with standard repertory operas, including La Bohème, done in English. We had a big dose of it back in the 50s and 60s, mostly more in comic opera than in tragic opera, but it was fairly widely done. Exactly why it didn't take, which it didn't, what combination of the inadequacies of the translations, I don't know. Will, do you have thoughts about? I know you have thoughts about that, but
I think we missed the chance in English because I think we didn't establish a body of translations at a time when an equivalent verse style had currency among us. I think the Italian versions of Manon and Carmen and Pearl Fishers and so on, and the French versions of Aida and all of that stuff was done and established closer to the time of the works, at a time when the translating poets could more easily enter the spirit of the first text, and they had big national opera houses and lots of subsidiary provincial opera houses in need of those translations. So boom, they had to be produced and they got established and people came to love them. And you know, they're not very good, but sometimes the original texts aren't very good either. I mean, as poetry, Un ballo in maschera is really just poor.
But
Just
they still do
plain poor.
the bad Italian translation of Vespri, so.
For instance, and yet the point is that when that bond with the public is formed, with the singers who are in the culture, who are growing up on those translations of Mozart or whatever, and communicating them to generations of audiences, you can get past slight inadequacies of the translation because there is this continuing bond. I just think we missed the chance for it. I don't think it can be done in English. Now.
That's yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I thought of that a little bit recently in my blog. I wrote a little bit about Carmen Jones, which was recently revived down at CSC, and which is not a translation really. It's an adaptation by Oscar Hammerstein of of Carmen into 1940s black language. And it was a big hit back then. And I started thinking about, well, what if we did want to do Bizet's full Carmen in English? Who could possibly translate it? And I thought about Richard Wilbur, who translated the Molière plays, who did the lyrics for Candide, wonderful translations with a tremendous sensibility about the original and the ability to put that into the actual poetic form. And I thought, yeah, maybe he could have done that. But I can't think of anyone else. I mean, I don't know all the poets, but anyone else have a question? Yes, please.
I've noticed that all the old singers, the great old singers, I can recall the way they sound. Right now, I can hear Ponselle, I can hear Tibaldi, I can hear Corelli, I hear Björling, I hear Wunderlich. I can hear their sounds in my ear, even though I'm not playing the recording. But today, I'm very hard-pressed to remember anybody's unique vocal thumbprint.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Tell us why we
Yeah.
arrived at this state.
Yeah.
And what can be done now?
Sorry, say it again, Bill. Sorry.
Do you have an opinion as to why we have arrived at this state of affairs, and what could be done about it to restore the advantage of performers' unique individuality and individual sound, individual vocal thumbprint?
Well, of course, to me, we're looking for something new. We're looking for I don't think we can just somehow restore the way things used to be, even in the days when I loved what they did. We have to find a way of working. That's kind of what the last part of my book is about. A way of working that really will fuse dramatic intent and dramatic understanding with singing, with really great singing. After all, the people you're talking about, some of the same people I would talk about, it relates to some of the same things we talked about before. Part of it is just vocal format. If a voice doesn't have all of the harmonic capability in it, the coloristic capability, if that isn't built into, structured into the voice, and that's a matter partly of growing up, partly a matter of training, everything that goes into the development of a voice, both before they ever take the first lesson and then what happens to them in training. If those things haven't been actually sort of hard-lined into the voice, then the singer cannot take advantage of them. There's nothing for him or her left to do but sing within this rather narrow framework of things that are available. And the fact that most of them still, I think there have been improvements in acting in opera. There's more acting that we could accept as at least plausible. There's less embarrassed, stiff stuff going on than there used to be. But that's not really where we have to get. We have to get to people actually, as I was talking with Marc about before, actually get into the specific, this acting term, moment-to-moment happenings and actions of a character. They're what the voice comes out of. They're what inflection comes out of. It's exactly what I mean. It's exactly what I'm intending to do right now at this moment, and how I'm intending to do it. What is the tone of voice? Those things which are instinctual with a lot of the singers that you mentioned, in their own languages, in the repertory that they grew up knowing the style of, right? They didn't have to be taught a lot of that stuff. Now, not only is most of that structuring, in my opinion, not being completely done, the voices just aren't getting there. They don't have that range of color to begin with. So, and every time they try to step out of it, they run into problems. So there's that to begin with, and then there's this lack, in my opinion. There's a way that musicians have and coaches have of going about explaining meaning. And oh, you mean this here, therefore, do that. That isn't how really, really good acting gets done. And we have to somehow make that step. There has to be in my opinion, a change in teaching where more of that structuring will be done. And I know I spoke with Marc a little bit about this, but look here, we've got this big system, this big academic to regional young artist system, where all this talent is like a big funnel. Hundreds, thousands of singers every year go pouring into the big end of it. And at the end, out come the people who have survived, the people who can go on into being associate young artists, then maybe get careers. And out of all of those people, there is not a single dramatic soprano, a single dramatic tenor, a single basso buffo, whatever category of real operatic voice you want to name. There are a lot of good musicians. There are a lot of competent singers. But somehow something's wrong there. And that has to do with training. And it's also true that the people who present themselves there at the big end of the funnel, they aren't the same people. They aren't Rosa Poncel at age 18. So it's not all the teacher's fault. But some way has to be found to that. I think a lot has to do with somehow getting to talent at an earlier age, programming in, getting them used to elocution, to rhetoric, to theatrical speech, and to developing their voices in more dramatic ways. Not all of them will get there, but it's inconceivable that out of all of these people trying to become singers, and it may be true what Marc has said, that many of them simply don't identify with this, that could be, but some of them certainly do. Somewhere, there's got to be a few, and it's not happening. So I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Very well, thank you.
Yes, sir.
None of the singers that this gentleman mentioned was educated in the American university system with one lesson a week. Took part for 7 years to produce Farinelli and other singers of that ilk. And this is one of the main problems that we have, because the singers that's typically going through a university don't get anywhere near what they need.
Yeah, I think so too. Is that you, Dan?
Yes.
Yes, hi,
Hi.
Dan Merrick. Yes, absolutely. And of course, the universities are not doing AIDA or Die Walküre or something. Once in a while, one of the big ones, Indiana, I remember the very first time that I became aware that university opera was becoming something really significant. Life magazine, this must have been 1951 maybe, Indiana University put on Parsifal. And they had singers there to do it. Charles Kuhlman was there. I forget who, maybe Walter Castle. I forget who all was in that cast, from the faculty, of course, not the students. But they did put on Parsifal, and I thought, wow. And a few of the very, pardon me?
Every year for 2 decades.
Every year they still do it, and I'm assuming still with faculty people in the...
Well, I think they stopped doing it every year around 1970.
Yeah, 1970, coincidence. Yeah. Yes, of course, I absolutely agree about that.
Well, the other thing is that when we get big voices, everybody shuts them down right away.
That's right.
Oh, you shouldn't sing Aida
That's
at
right.
25.
That's
no,
right.
You don't sing the whole performance, but you learn the role, so when you're 30, then you're ready. And,
That's right. I can't tell you how many sopranos I've had in my studio who have been through, respectable conservatory or music school training, and they've been told, never use your chest voice. I mean, don't use it. Don't cultivate it at all. Now, a few people can get away with that for a while, and you can get pretty voices, but it's ludicrous. Anyone else?
Why do they say that?
Pardon me?
Why would they say that? That's what.
Why would they say that? Because, well, I don't know, of course, all the reasons that all of those people say that. But I think a lot of it has to do with protecting their own butts. They have a, responsibility, a protective responsibility. They have their juries they have to present people to at the end of every year. They have to make sure they don't damage anybody. And it's absolutely true that if you take a young woman with, it doesn't even matter what kind of soprano voice or mezzo-soprano voice they may have, light or heavy, big or small, and she doesn't have anything much in the way of a chest register down where it belongs, then when you start to cultivate it, you create a new series of problems. You create a break, a passaggio. Before there wasn't any passaggio because there wasn't any chest voice. The voice just fades as it comes down to the bottom. And if it's a nice, pretty lyric voice, she can go on singing that way, maybe very effectively for a while. But the teachers, as Dan was saying, who get their students for one lesson a week in the middle of everything else that's going on, the spectacle, either they don't know how to do it, which I think is the case a lot of the time, but once you start to open that up, you've got a whole new bag full of problems. You have to find out how to strengthen that, how to blend it with the head register in the area of the passaggio, how to balance the two mechanisms, and that's a hard job. That's a lot harder than, yes, and that takes time. It takes time, repetition, it's sloggy work. The students will be upset from time to time because they, oh my God, now I've got a break. Yeah, you're on your way to having a voice. So I mean, there's a whole range of reasons, I'm sure, but I think those are the main ones. They don't want to be responsible for turning out singers who wind up after their 2, 3, 4 years who have a lot of problems with their voice, and they haven't been able to finish the job. Even the ones who know how to do that, who would have a good line on it, and I'm sure there are some. I mean, I know. I've had a couple of my students go to a couple of other programs, and they've done very well. They've had good instruction. But
can I add something to that
sure.
Kind of comes out of Conrad's book? That one aspect of how that could ever become possible, that they don't build that part of the voice, is us having gone through a period that he describes where certain kinds of plush, laid-back voices could give the impression, a certain impression of smoothness and beauty, mainly on microphone, mainly on recording, that seemed to exclude chest voice or to touch it very lightly, and that simply doesn't work. Many of those same singers would get in the opera house and do something entirely different because they needed to and they could. But they created a role model for this very delicately shaded sound that winds up just being a hollow nothing when you hear it in the theater.
Yes, there's a lot about this in the book, by the way, everybody. There's a lot about this, and I talk some about the, there's a little book called The Lemonade Kids. It was about the singers who, the Lemonade Opera used to be a small opera company here in New York. It was a nice little company, and they did, for example, they did the American premiere of Prokofiev's Betrothal in a Monastery, a big major work. But she talks about the generation, and I talk in my book, the generation of singers that we had here in America just prior to and during World War II, and who emerged at the end of World War II. There's a whole bunch of voices that you would recognize as being among the great singers of that time. Hardly any of them, there wasn't this big colossus that we have of university or music school training into the apprentice programs and on into the profession. There were 3 or 4 big companies and a couple of touring companies and a few regional civic operas that did 1 or 2 productions a year. There simply wasn't the system that we have now. So singers sank, or swam. And They studied privately, nearly all of them. They took whatever, as she calls it in her book, cinetics. They would work on the cinetics with a private acting coach, and they would take fencing, and they would work on languages. They put together programs of one kind or another. Richard Tucker, Jan Pierce, Robert Merrill, Leonard Warren, Dorothy Kirsten, Blanche Thiebaum. We can go on a whole bunch of people who then, with very little of what we would recognize as good training, credentialed training, most of them didn't have BAs, and with very little performance experience. Richard Tucker made his debut at the Met as Enzo Grimaldo. His previous operatic experiences was 2 performances of Alfredo over at the Brooklyn Academy. That was it. He had a lot of cantorial experience, and he had developed his voice somewhat along that model. Many other examples that we could cite. People, they just started out there, they performed on the Borst circuit, they performed in summer stock, they performed at Radio City Music Hall, and they just stood up and started doing it. Now they had deficiencies. Some of the deficiencies that they had might have been addressed by some of what goes on now in our system. That's true. And you can listen to some of them and say, oh my God. You say, he sings terrible French. Yes, his French diction is no good. But meanwhile, he's singing Don Jose pretty well. And if you went to see him in the opera house, you could get pretty excited. So those are trade-offs, you know. Yes?
I'm 200 pages into your book, but the thing I loved right away was eye-driven as opposed to ear-driven. And I think that's the
I'm sorry, what as opposed to what?
eye-driven in
There you go.
ear-driven.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is a huge change. I remember Wagner said that the greatest voices were all put into the ugliest bodies. So
Yep.
that's a big problem today.
Yep.
As far as great voices,
Yep.
like this
Yep.
gentleman was talking about.
So have we about done it?
You think Rosa Poncel could make it nowadays, going through the system?
Well, that's the thing. In a piece I once wrote for the Music Educators Journal, I asked, how would Shaliapin make out at Santa Fe in the Associate Apprentice Artist Program? You know, I mean, there's an example. I mean, one of the very few singers that everybody agrees on. Yeah, he was a great singing actor. The people who believe in Meyerhold claim him for their side. The people who believe in the method acting claim him for their side. And everybody agrees this guy was some kind of singer. Now, when he was 19 years old, he was kicking around in the southern parts of the Soviet Union, of Russia, Ukraine, and without much of anything in the way of training, he was singing leading bass roles in those provincial companies. I don't know how well he sang them, but he did sing them. And he developed his personality, his taking the stageness from doing that. And then he studied for a little while with a teacher down there, and then went up to St. Petersburg and began his major career. Different times, different places, of course, you know. But yes, we take possible talents like that, like Shaliapin or like Poncel. Now, Poncel came right out of vaudeville. She grew up in an Italian-American household in Meriden, Connecticut. Probably a pretty loud household, I imagine. She and her sister sang in vaudeville acoustically in the theaters of the vaudeville circuit. Some of them were fairly large. And then, bingo. She's singing Leonora in La Forza del Destino with Caruso and Amato and Mardones on the opening night in the Metropolitan Opera. That couldn't happen today because she wouldn't be at that place in life today. And I don't know whether you could do anything to train her into it at this point. But thank you all so much. It's a great evening.